Henry Ford has one of the most insane work ethics that I've ever read about. At one point in time, his company was making half of all the motor vehicles in the entire world. That is just insane. But what's even more insane is Henry Ford. In case you don't know that much about him, he is the founder of the Ford Motor Company, which is one of the most successful car companies in the world. They created the concept of the assembly line, and they created the Model T, which was the most financially successful car to have ever been made. I just finished reading Henry Ford's autobiography, and I am just completely blown away by him. He is one of the most hardworking, most intense work ethic, has some of the most brilliant principles that I've ever read about, and his story is just truly amazing. This book is just filled with knowledge on how to run a good business, how to make a good product, and just great principles for how to live life. And so what I decided to do was break this book down into the 8 principles that built Henry Ford. So with that said, let's just get into the first principle. Okay, so we're going to start off with this quote that I think perfectly describes Henry Ford's philosophy towards his work. This was when he was trying to make the fastest cars possible, and he said, "During this time of reflection, I was far from idle. We were going ahead with a 4-cylinder motor and the building of a pair of big racing cars. I had plenty of time, for I never left my business. I do not believe a man can ever leave his business. He ought to think of it by day and dream of it by night. It is nice to plan to do one's work in office hours, to take up the work in the morning, to drop it in the evening, and not have a care until the next morning. It is perfectly possible to do that if one is so constituted as to be willing through all of his life to accept direction, to be an employee, possibly a responsible employee, but not a director or manager of anything." Man, this is such a great quote because it is exactly how Henry Ford thinks, and it's exactly how so many of the modern greats think today. These types of people just have a complete obsession about their work, and they're just working 24/7. Jensen Huang thinks like this, Todd Graves thinks like this, Elon Musk thinks like this, and Elon actually has this great quote that goes, "It's simple math. If you work 100 hours a week and someone else works 50, you will get twice as much done in the same amount of time." The reason why I wanted to include that Elon quote is because Henry Ford said the exact same thing 100 years earlier. He said, "A 10 horsepower engine will not pull as much as 20. The man who keeps brain office hours limits his horsepower. If he is satisfied to pull only the load that he has, well and good, that is his affair. But he must not complain if another, who has increased his horsepower, pulls more than he does. Leisure and work bring different results. If a man wants leisure and gets it, then he has no cause to complain. But he cannot have both leisure and the results of work." Here's the key takeaway from the viewpoint of Ford. Work-life balance is a myth. If you want to be hyper successful, and I'm not talking about the 10% or even the 1%, but the 0.01% of people, then you have to work like the 0.01% of people. History repeats itself over and over again. Human nature does not change. And so it is a pattern that for these people, their work really begins at 5 p.m. because that is when everyone else is stopping. It is in these hours when they actually get ahead because over time, the extra workload that they're putting in compounds. This is exactly how Henry Ford thinks, and what he says on this is, if he intends to remain, always be a manual laborer, then he should forget about his work when the whistle blows. But if he intends to go forward and do anything, the whistle is only a signal to start thinking over the day's work in order to discover how it might be done better. To Ford, and he repeats this over and over again in the book, working all day is an absolute necessity because it is in those after hours where the real work begins, where they reflect over the day, they see how it was done, they see how it could have been done better, and they plan the future. And so if you are looking to Henry Ford as a model of what you want to build or how you want to work, then you have to be working 24/7. You can think of it how he thinks of it. You can imagine 2 engines. In this case, let's use 2 10 horsepower engines. One of them runs every day from 9 to 5 and then stops for the night. Then the next day it starts again, but the other engine is constantly running, constantly working. The second one isn't just going to win linearly over the long run, but it will win exponentially because it is already moving. It doesn't have to deal with the cost of acceleration every day. At the end of the day, so much of what is going to be said in this video comes down to this one beautiful quote from Henry Ford. "The man who has the largest capacity for work and thought is the man who is bound to succeed." This is one of the best ideas in the book that everyone probably knows, but no one actually practices it, because if people actually did practice it, then there would be way more breakthroughs in the world today. When Ford was thinking about entering the car market, he said, "The idea of gas engines was by no means new, but this was the first time that a really serious effort had been made to put them on the market. They were received with interest rather than enthusiasm, and I do not recall anyone who thought that the internal combustion engine could ever have more than a limited use. All the wisest people demonstrated conclusively that the engine could not compete with steam. They never thought that it might carve out a career for itself. Probably the craziest fact about the car is that no one knew why they needed a car at first. They were extremely expensive and they were extremely loud. And as a bonus, they scared all the horses on the road because they were so loud. And so in the book, Henry Ford talks about everyone else's opinions on the car and how they were all against it. He calls these people the wise people, by the way. And he said, at first, the horseless carriage was considered merely a freak notion, and many wise people explained with particularity why it could never be more than a toy. No man of money even thought of it as a commercial possibility. I cannot imagine why each new means of transportation meets with such opposition. This quote kind of comes down to a philosophy coined by Peter Thiel, where he talks about creating a monopoly. He says that the only way to create a monopoly is to create something that no one else is creating. And this boils down to a much more simple philosophy. You have to go all in on a contrarian idea, something that no one else is looking at, but maybe you and a couple other people see the potential in it. In economics, this is what's known as finding a blue ocean versus a red ocean. A blue ocean is a market where no one else is operating in, no one sees the potential, and a red ocean is a market where everyone sees the potential and there's many competitors in the space. What Henry Ford did is he found his blue ocean market. Everyone at the time rode around on horses, or it was the horses that pulled the carriage behind them, and so no one really was competing in the car market because they didn't think there was a market to compete in. But remember what Ford said at the end of his quote, I cannot imagine why each new means of transportation meets with such opposition. And so the lesson is that sometimes you just have to ignore the market completely. If something doesn't make sense to you, or if you see the potential in something that no one else does, investigate it further and find your blue ocean market. And the biggest key here is to ignore the wise people. This is something that I see in like every biography I read, but for some reason, whenever someone has a new idea, everyone just comes at them and tells them why it won't work. It's like a law of the universe. People said it to Henry Ford about cars. People said it to Sam Walton about small town shopping. People even said it to Elon about reusable rockets. It happens over and over again. And Ford says about this, that is the way with wise people. They are so wise and practical that they always know to a dot just why something cannot be done. They always know the limitations. That is why I never employ an expert in full bloom. If I ever wanted to kill opposition by unfair means, I would endow the opposition with experts. True innovation happens when you ignore the experts. Of course, you have to ignore the experts and be right, but you only have to be right once to change the world. So one of the biggest commonalities that you see with a lot of the greats is that they are constantly breaking things apart to see how those things work. You see this especially a lot in the childhoods of many of the greats. Elon as a kid took apart video games and reconstructed them. Richard Feynman was always tinkering with radios, and Henry Ford was constantly taking apart watches. He actually grew up on a farm with his parents, and he had this little workshop, and he says, "My mother always said that I was born a mechanic. I had a kind of workshop with odds and ends of metal tools before I had anything else." He actually got kind of obsessed with watches in his little workshop, and he continues to say, "When I was 13, I managed for the first time to put a watch together so that it would keep time. By the time I was 15, I could do almost anything in watch repairing." The key concept here is that the greats are always taking things apart to understand how those things work. Reading and studying and watching videos like this is a great thing to do, but it's only great if you actually apply what you're learning. If you actually go and you use the information that you're intaking, and Henry Ford agrees with this. He says, "There is an immense amount to be learned simply by tinkering with things. It is not possible to learn from books how everything is made. A real mechanic ought to know how nearly everything is made. Machines are to a mechanic what books are to a writer. He gets ideas from them, and if he has any brains, he will apply those ideas." Machines are to a mechanic what books are to a writer. That is such a great line, and that's exactly how you can think of this. As a writer, you are constantly dissecting books, taking them apart to understand how they work. You study the story structure, you study the character types, the length of chapters, paragraph sentences. You just take apart the book completely to understand it. Walt Disney actually did a very similar thing with movies. When he was making Snow White, he brought in animators to teach classes, posing artists to teach about posing. He broke down the story structure completely. He dissected other stories with his teams. Every joke was carefully crafted. I mean, it's just hard to explain how much they dissected everything at Walt Disney Studios to create the beauty that was Snow White. It's the exact same thing to Henry Ford, except instead of movies, it's mechanics. To Ford, you have to break down a machine into its smallest components and understand how every small component fits into the bigger picture to truly understand how the machine works. All the best engineers think like this, and Ford also applied this philosophy in his business, so it really was a philosophy that he lived by in everything. So one of Ford's first inventions was a machine called the gasoline buggy, and here's what he says. Nearly all of these various features had been planned in advance. That is the way I have always worked. I draw a plan and work out every detail on the plan before starting to build. For otherwise, one will waste a great deal of time in makeshifts as the work goes on, and the finished article will not have coherence. It will not be rightly proportioned. Many investors fail because they do not distinguish between planning and experimenting. So one thing that's super interesting about Ford is that he wasn't only a extremely hard worker, but he was also a relentless planner. And this is a big problem in the modern world. There are a lot of really hardworking people, but a lot of it doesn't come to fruition simply because the plan isn't quite right. And remember that quote that holds Ford's entire philosophy. The man who has the largest capacity for work and thought is the man who is bound to succeed. As much as hard work is important, the plan is equally as important, and all the industrialists were relentless planners. Rockefeller, before he would make a decision, he would gather his team together and lay out everything on the table, and only then would he make a decision and go all in on that decision. Andrew Carnegie was very similar. He planned relentlessly. For an example, when he switched over to the new Bessemer process for creating steel, he started by learning everything about it and planning relentlessly, and only after learning everything he could on it, he would go all in on it. One people that they all looked up to, Napoleon, was constantly planning. Before a battle, he would take these note cards and he would write down every possible scenario that could happen, and on the back of the note cards, he would write down how he would react if that scenario happened. This is what relentless planning looks like. It's being prepared for any possible scenario that could play out, your exact reaction to what you would do. Henry Ford is very similar. This story is actually a mix of the last two principles, which is breaking things apart and relentless planning, but when Ford was making the Model T, he broke it down into 4 parts: the engine, the frame, the rear axle, and the front axle, and he pre-planned the assembly line to fit these 4 categories to which each car would come together in the end. Every part of the process was planned beforehand, and this was how he was able to conquer the entire industry. It was all planned from the beginning. The great industrialists are great planners too. There's this great quote that goes, "Money comes naturally as a result of value." And I think Henry Ford would agree with this statement 100%. Believe me, throughout this entire book, he is constantly talking about how weird the economy works and how people look at it all wrong. Just all sorts of criticisms for how people think about money and business. He says, "The most surprising feature of business as it was conducted was the large attention given to finance and the small attention to service. That seemed to me to be reversing the natural process, which is that the money should come as a result of the work and not before the work." And then he made very similar arguments to a type of sort of VC culture. Businessmen believed you could do anything by financing it. If it did not go through on the first financing, then the idea was to refinance. The process of refinancing was simply the game of sending good money after bad. In the majority of cases, the need of refinancing arises from bad management, and the effect of refinancing is simply to pay the poor managers to keep up their bad management a little longer. It is merely a postponement of the day of judgment. And the reason why Henry Ford, trust me, throughout the entire book is so repulsed by this sort of ideology is because he values the product and the service over everything. He was very much like Sam Walton in the sense that they really cared about having the best product for the lowest price, and that was it. They believed that if they could just do that, then they would conquer the business world. He said, "I determined absolutely that never would I join a company in which finance came before the work, or in which bankers or financiers had a part, for the only foundation of real business is service." This is actually a really big problem, especially in a place like the United States where venture capitalism culture is just so big. I mean, it is just so easy to raise millions of dollars here and just continue to pour so much money into a project that provides no real value or no real service. It was actually a trend on Instagram at one point where people were joking about VCs giving their money to 20-year-olds to build an AI B2B startup. If you know, you know, it's a crazy world, man. The point is that Henry Ford would be absolutely repulsed by this. He was obsessed with providing a good service for the consumer, and that was his only priority. His entire business philosophy can be scaled to just that, and he says, "Money placed in a business is not a charge on the business, or rather should not be. It ceases to be money and becomes, or should become, an engine of production, and it is therefore worth what it produces, and not a fixed sum according to some scale that has no bearing upon the particular business in which the money has been placed. Any return should come after it has produced, not before." People like Sam Walton and Jeff Bezos had a very similar ideology where they believed in having a completely customer-centric business. They put service over everything. If you look at history, you see it repeated over and over again. The businesses that succeed are the ones that put the service over everything. They don't focus on the stock valuation because the real value lies in the service, in the value that you add to the world. And good business philosophy is to focus on the service. I have noticed a great love for regularity. Men fall into the half-alive habit. Seldom does the cobbler take up with the newfangled way of soling shoes, and seldom does the artisan willingly take up with new methods in his trade. Habit conduces to a certain inertia, and any disturbance of it affects the mind like trouble. Businessmen go down with their businesses because they like the old way so well that they cannot bring themselves to change. One sees them all about, men who do not know that yesterday is past, and who woke up this morning with their last year's ideas. It could almost be written down as a formula that when a man begins to think that he has found his method, he had better begin a most searching examination of himself to see whether some part of his brain has not gone to sleep. There is subtle danger in a man thinking that he is fixed for life. It indicates that the next jolt of the wheel of progress is going to fling him off. Okay, so this one is phenomenal. It is so clear in Ford's life that he is so against any form of complacency. In the book, he is constantly talking about certain people around him who were satisfied with that results they got or who were sort of fixed in their ways, and he is just the complete opposite. For him, the price could always be lower, the manufacturing line could always be faster, the product can always be better. At one point, even his stockholders wanted him to slow down, and he says about this, some of the stockholders were seriously alarmed when our production reached 100 cars a day. They wanted to do something to stop me from ruining the company, and when I replied to the effect that 100 cars a day was only a trifle, and that I hoped before long to make 1,000 a day, they were inexpressibly shocked, and I understand seriously contemplated court action. Oh man, I don't even know what I would do in that situation. Straight go to war with stockholders, I guess. It is kind of insane how many similarities there are between Henry Ford and Elon Musk. Their philosophies are just so similar, and it makes sense because they both have car companies. Both of them are never satisfied with the metrics, and so what they do is they set these crazy high goals that just shock people. They shock the shareholders, they shock the employees because the goals are just so big. But that is exactly the point. It shocks people to the point where there's just no room for complacency, and that's exactly what they want. They are repulsed by even the thought of complacency. Another commonality is this: life as I see it is not a location but a journey. Even the man who most feels himself settled is not settled. He is probably sagging back. Everything is in flux, and it was meant to be. Life flows. We may live at the same number street, but it is never the same man who lives there. Straight fire, but the similarity is that they are always seeking to improve. To them, the journey is the reward. There's no end to the journey. There's no end goal to where they're going to stop working, and that's a really beautiful concept, especially when the journey is filled with so much intense pressure and intense work. This actually goes back to a biblical principle where true meaning is found in the depth of the shadows. So many of the greats have this philosophy where their sense of meaning and purpose comes from the pain that comes from work. And Henry Ford kind of believes this as well. He sees himself as providing a useful service for mankind. He made an extremely expensive item that no one could have into something that everyone could have and enjoy. And he did it because he loves the journey. The journey is the reward. And so I'm sure if he were here, he would tell you to beware of complacency. So in the book, it's very clear that Ford is obsessed with simplicity. He said, "The best way is always the simplest. The addicts of the world are cluttered up with complicated failures. And many people are busy trying to find better ways of doing things that should not have to be done at all. There is no progress in merely finding a better way to do a useless thing." And so because of this philosophy, he likes to keep things as simple as he possibly can. He even credits the success of the Model T to this. He said, "The design which I settled upon was called Model T. The most important feature of the new model, which if it were accepted as I thought it would be, I intended to make the only model and then start into real production, was its simplicity. There were but 4 constructional units in the car: the power plant, the frame, the front axle, and the rear axle. It was because he made the assembly line so simple that he was able to mass produce it and give it to the entire world." Once again, Elon has said the exact same thing that Henry Ford just said in this quote. Elon is always talking about how a lot of his job is to move through the assembly lines at his company and cut out any part of the process that does not need to be there, because you don't need to improve on something that doesn't need to be there. This is a very simple lesson, but it can be applied to everything. So many people in the modern world overcomplicate things. Their to-do lists, the work that's in front of them, their relationships, but the most successful people are the ones who keep things simple. They cut out anything that doesn't need to be there, and they focus intensely on what's actually important. It's not about improving everything that's in front of you, but it's about taking away the things that don't need to be there. The Edison Company offered me the general superintendency of the company, but only on the condition that I would give up my gas engine and devote myself to something really useful. I had to choose between my job and my automobile. I chose my automobile, or rather, I gave up the job. There was really nothing in the way of a choice, for already I knew that the car was bound to be a success. I quit my job on August 15th, 1899, and went into the automobile business. So I wanted to end with this because part of being an extremely hard worker is having an extremely clear vision. Henry Ford, right from the beginning, knew that the car was going to be a success, even though very few people believed in it. But because he knew in his heart that the car would succeed, he was able to make the sacrifice of his job in order to pursue this business. The lesson is very simple. You have to have full belief in what you are doing, almost to the point of delusion, or at least to the point other people think you're delusional. There's this concept called the reality distortion field that was used by Steve Jobs, where you believe in something so much that the belief becomes true. And that's the type of self-belief that a lot of the greats had. Ford said from the very beginning, "I will build a motor car for the great multitude. It will be large enough for the family, but small enough for the individual to run and care for. It will be constructed of the best materials, by the best men to be hired, after the simplest designs that the modern engineering can devise, but it will be so low in price that no man making a good salary will be unable to own one and enjoy with his family the blessing of hours of pleasure in God's great open spaces." At the end of the day, Ford's formula comes down to this: a crazy work ethic plus a clear vision plus full self-belief. If you have these three, then there is not a single chance in the world that you won't succeed. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, you might like this video, which is very similar to this one, except about Rockefeller's crazy work ethic. Also, please check out my new website. I just launched coaching services if you want to be coached by me to be more productive, or if you just need historical wisdom, that's going to be there for you. That's it. See ya.